It was a crisp October evening, the kind where the air has just enough bite to remind you that Halloween is near. The houses in our neighborhood were festooned with carved pumpkins, plastic skeletons, and the occasional cobweb-draped porch. The streets were filled with laughter, the sound of eager children scurrying from house to house, their costumes rustling in the breeze. Halloween was a big deal in our town, and this year was no different. The first sign that something was wrong was subtle, so subtle that no one really noticed at first. A little boy, maybe 6 or 7, dressed as a cowboy, had been trick-or-treating with his older sister. They had been seen at the end of the cul-de-sac, skipping along with their bags of candy nearly overflowing. But somewhere between Mrs. Thompson's house with its pumpkin pie-scented candles and the old Miller place, the boy vanished. His sister, hysterical and clutching her own bag of candy, was found by a neighbor, sobbing that her brother was gone. The police were called and they combed the neighborhood, but all they found was the boy's trick-or-treat bag lying in the middle of the sidewalk, its contents untouched. No one thought much of it then. Kids wandered off all the time, they said. He'd turn up by morning, probably sleeping in some cozy nook he found on his way home. But morning came and the boy didn't. And then another child went missing. And another. The disappearances were random, scattered across different parts of town. There was no pattern, no clue as to who might be taking them. Just a growing collection of abandoned candy bags, each one sitting ominously on the sidewalk, as if placed there on purpose. The bags were always full, not a single piece of candy missing. The police, now under immense pressure, were baffled. They searched tirelessly, but they didn't find a trace. No footprints, no witnesses, nothing. That's when the whispers began. Kids at school started talking about the candy collector, a ghost story that had been passed down for generations, though no one really believed it. According to legend, the candy collector was an ancient spirit who haunted Halloween, searching for children who were too greedy with their candy. If a child refused to share, the collector would come for them, snatching them away into the night, never to be seen again. Of course, we didn't believe in such things, at least not at first. But with each new disappearance, the story grew more sinister. The older kids swore that the collector was real, that he was taking the children to punish them for hoarding their candy. They said if you shared your candy with others, you'd be safe. If you didn't, you'd vanish like the rest. I wasn't one to believe in ghost stories, but after hearing the tale so many times, it started to get under my skin. What if there was some truth to it? What if just this once the stories were real? It was on the night of Halloween when things truly took a terrifying turn. A group of us decided to see if the legend was real. We figured if we could catch the candy collector, we'd be heroes. At the very least, we might find out what was happening to all the kids. There were 5 of us. We were armed with flashlights, walkie-talkies, and of course, our own bags of candy. The plan was simple. We'd walk the same route the missing kids had taken, keeping a close eye on everything. If anything strange happened, we'd share our candy, just in case. The night was eerily quiet as we made our way through the neighborhood. The usual buzz of Halloween was gone, replaced by a heavy silence that made every creak and rustle seem magnified. The streets were empty. Most parents had kept their kids indoors, too afraid to let them out after what had been happening. As we passed the Miller place, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The others felt it too. I could see it in their eyes, the way they gripped their flashlights a little tighter, the way they kept glancing over their shoulders. We reached the end of the cul-de-sac, where the first boy had vanished. The streetlights flickered, casting long, twisted shadows across the pavement. We stood there, uncertain, when suddenly we heard it. A soft rustling, like the sound of leaves being stirred by the wind. But there was no wind. The sound grew louder, closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized it was coming from behind us. I turned, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The rustling stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving only an oppressive silence in its wake. Then, without warning, one of our flashlights flickered and went out. The owner of the flashlight, a boy named Ethan, cursed under his breath and smacked the side of it. As he did, a small, shadowy figure darted past us, too quick to see clearly, but leaving a cold, sickening dread in its wake. We all froze, the air thick with tension. No one dared move or speak, our breaths coming in short, panicked bursts. I felt a chill run down my spine, as if icy fingers were trailing across my skin. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, leaving only the echo of its presence behind. Ethan was the first to break the silence, his voice trembling. Did you guys see that? None of us answered. We didn't need to. The look in each other's eyes said it all. We decided then and there that it was time to go home. Maybe the stories were just that, stories, but whatever was out there, we didn't want to find out. We turned back, retracing our steps, but something had changed. The air felt colder, the shadows darker, and the sense of being watched was more intense than ever. We didn't stop until we were safely back on my porch, where we dumped our candy on the steps and agreed that we'd all share it the next day. As we stood there, trying to laugh off the night's events, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still watching us. And then I saw it. On the far side of the street, just beyond the reach of the streetlights, a figure stood watching us. It was tall, its features obscured by the shadows, but I knew deep down who it was. The candy collector? I blinked, and the figure was gone, leaving nothing but an empty street and the chilling realization that the story wasn't over. Not yet. The next day at school, the mood was tense. Everyone had heard about our encounter the night before, and the whispers about the candy collector grew louder. Kids who had laughed off the stories before now avoided the topic, their eyes filled with fear. It wasn't just a ghost story anymore, it was real, and it was happening right here in our town. Ethan, who had seen the shadowy figure with us, was particularly shaken. He hadn't said much since last night, but his pale face and trembling hands spoke volumes. We all tried to act normal, but the truth was, none of us could get the image of that figure out of our heads. It was burned into our minds like a bad dream that wouldn't go away. After school, we gathered in the empty lot behind the playground, a place where we could talk without anyone overhearing. It was just the 5 of us again, Ethan, myself, and the others who had been with us the night before. We sat in a rough circle on the cold, hard ground, our bags of candy sitting between us as if they were a sacred offering. "We have to do something," Ethan finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but I could hear the fear beneath it. "We can't just let this happen. More kids are going to disappear if we don't figure out what's going on." "But what can we do?" one of the others asked, his voice shaky. "We're just kids, we can't fight a ghost." "It's not a ghost," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "It's something else, something old." "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, leaning in closer. I hesitated, the words feeling strange on my tongue. Last night, when I saw it, the figure, I felt like it was more than just a shadow. It felt ancient, like it's been here for a long time. Maybe it's connected to the town somehow, something from the past. The others exchanged nervous glances, and I could see they were all thinking the same thing I was, that this was bigger than just a ghost story, that maybe, just maybe, the legend of the candy collector had roots deeper than we could imagine. "What if it's like one of those old stories, you know?" Ethan said after a moment. "Like a curse or something. Maybe there's a reason it's happening now. Maybe something triggered it." We sat in silence for a few moments, letting the weight of his words sink in. If this was true, if there really was something ancient and cursed haunting our town, then we were in way over our heads. But we couldn't just sit back and do nothing. "We need to find out more about this, whatever it is," I said finally. "We need to know what we're dealing with." "How do we do that?" another boy asked. "The adults won't believe us. They'll just think we're making it up." "We don't need the adults," Ethan said, a determined look in his eyes. "We just need information. There's gotta be something in the town records, something that explains all of this." The idea of sneaking into the town hall or the library after hours was terrifying, but we all knew it was the only way. If we were going to stop this thing, we needed to know what it was and how to fight it. That night, we met up again, this time armed with flashlights and a map of the town. We knew that the library had an archive section with old newspapers and town records, and if there was any place where we might find clues, it was there. We made our way through the darkened streets, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. The usually friendly houses now loomed over us like silent sentinels, their windows dark and unwelcoming. It felt like the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. When we reached the library, we found it locked, as we expected. But Ethan had thought ahead and brought a set of lockpicks he'd borrowed from his older brother. It took a few tense minutes, but eventually the door clicked open and we slipped inside. The library was eerie in the dark, the rows of books and shelves casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. We made our way to the back, where the archives were kept, and began searching through the dusty records. It didn't take long to find what we were looking for. Buried in an old newspaper from decades ago was an article about a string of disappearances that had plagued the town back in the 1950s. The details were eerily similar to what was happening now. Children vanishing on Halloween night, their candy bags left behind. But there was something else, something that sent a chill down my spine as I read it. The article mentioned an old house on the outskirts of town, a place that had once belonged to a man named Mr. Craven. According to the article, Craven had been an outcast, a recluse who rarely left his home. The townspeople had whispered that he was involved in dark rituals, that he had made a pact with something evil. And when the disappearances began, they had blamed him. The article ended with a chilling note. Mr. Craven had disappeared shortly after the last child went missing. and his house had been abandoned ever since. The police had searched the property but found nothing, and the case was left unsolved. As I read the final lines, I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. The candy collector wasn't just a story. It was real, and somehow it was connected to Mr. Craven and his house. "We have to go there," Ethan said, his voice low. "We have to go to Craven's house and find out what's really going on." The others nodded, though I could see the fear in their eyes. We knew that this was dangerous, that we were risking our lives by going to that house. But we also knew that if we didn't, more kids would disappear. And we couldn't let that happen. We made our way out of the library, the night air biting at our skin as we walked toward the outskirts of town. The path to Craven's house was overgrown and barely visible in the dark, but we pressed on, the weight of our mission pushing us forward. As we approached the house, a sense of dread washed over me. The place was a ruin, its windows broken and its walls covered in ivy. The air around it felt thick, oppressive, as if the very ground was soaked in malice. We stood there staring up at the house, knowing that once we stepped inside, there would be no turning back. With a deep breath, Ethan pushed open the creaking gate, and we stepped onto the property. The house loomed before us, a dark and twisted shadow against the night sky, and then, just as we reached the front door, we heard it. A low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from all around us, filling the air with a sense of overwhelming dread. "Come inside." The voice was like ice, sending shivers down my spine. We exchanged nervous glances, but there was no turning back now. We had to find out the truth, no matter what. Ethan pushed the door open, and we stepped inside. The darkness swallowed us whole, and the door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang. The door's slam echoed through the house like a gunshot, reverberating off the decaying walls and rattling our nerves. We stood frozen in the entryway, our flashlights the only source of light in the oppressive darkness. The air inside was stale, heavy with dust and the scent of something rotting deep within the house. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing in our fear. The floorboards creaked under our feet as we moved deeper into the house, the beams of our flashlights darting across the walls, revealing glimpses of torn wallpaper, broken furniture, and cobwebs that seemed to stretch endlessly into the shadows. The house was a relic of another time, long abandoned and forgotten by the world, except by whatever still lingered within its walls. "Stick together," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of our own breathing. "We can't afford to get separated." We nodded, huddling closer as we moved forward, our footsteps unnaturally loud in the silence. The house seemed to stretch on forever, a labyrinth of dark hallways and decaying rooms. Every so often, we would hear a distant creak or a soft thud, and we would freeze, our hearts pounding, waiting for something to jump out at us. But nothing did. It wasn't until we reached the back of the house that we found something that made our blood run cold. It was a basement door slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness beyond it. The smell of rot was stronger here, almost unbearable, and it was clear that whatever was down there was the source of it. Ethan reached out, his hand trembling, and pushed the door open the rest of the way. The hinges groaned in protest, and the door swung inward, revealing a steep staircase that descended into pitch-black darkness. "Are we really going down there?" one of the others whispered, his voice shaking. "We have to," Ethan said, though his voice wasn't much steadier. "This is where we'll find the answers." With no other choice, we started down the stairs, one by one, the darkness closing in around us with each step. The stairs creaked under our weight, threatening to give way at any moment, but we kept going, driven by a mix of fear and determination. When we reached the bottom, we found ourselves in a large, open space. The basement was much bigger than we had expected, the walls lined with shelves filled with dusty, decaying objects that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. The smell of rot was overpowering here, making it hard to breathe. But there was something else in the air, too. A strange, metallic scent that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Then in the far corner of the room, our flashlights caught something that made us all stop dead in our tracks. It was a door, heavy and iron-bound, with a large padlock securing it. The door was different from the rest of the house, newer somehow, as if it had been added much later. The metal gleamed in the light, and I could see strange symbols carved into the wood around the edges, symbols that made my skin crawl just looking at them. "What the hell is this?" Ethan muttered, moving closer to the door. He reached out to touch the padlock, but as soon as his fingers brushed against the cold metal, a loud crash echoed through the basement, as if something heavy had fallen upstairs. We all jumped, our flashlights swinging wildly as we searched for the source of the noise. But there was nothing, just the oppressive darkness and the silence that followed, thicker than ever. "Maybe we should leave," one of the others said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "This place isn't right." "We can't leave," Ethan said, his voice firm despite the fear in his eyes. "Not until we know what's behind that door." Reluctantly, we nodded, and Ethan went back to examining the padlock. It was old but sturdy, the kind that would need a key to open. But there was no key in sight, no indication of where it might be. And then we heard it, the sound of footsteps above us, slow and deliberate, as if someone, or something, was moving through the house, searching for us. We froze, our breath catching in our throats as the footsteps grew louder, closer. They moved through the house with purpose, not the random creaks and groans we'd heard before. Whoever or whatever it was, it knew we were here. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs, and the basement door creaked open, the sound echoing through the space like a death knell. We turned off our flashlights, plunging ourselves into darkness, hoping that whatever was up there wouldn't see us, wouldn't come down those stairs. But it did. We heard the slow, deliberate steps descending the staircase, each one sending a jolt of terror through our bodies. In the darkness, I could feel the others pressing closer together, our collective fear almost suffocating. The air grew colder, and I could hear the faint sound of breathing, harsh, labored, not our own. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs, and then nothing. The silence was worse than the footsteps. It was a thick, choking silence, the kind that made you want to scream just to break it. But none of us dared make a sound. We stayed huddled together, barely breathing, waiting for whatever was in the basement with us to make its move. Then out of the darkness came a voice, low, rasping, and filled with malice. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice sent a bolt of terror through me, and I felt my heart nearly stop. It was a voice unlike any I'd ever heard, filled with a deep, ancient anger. Whoever or whatever it was not human. Suddenly a blinding light flared to life, and we all screamed. The light was coming from behind us, from the direction of the iron-bound door. It was searing, almost too bright to look at. But in its glow, I could see the silhouette of a figure standing at the bottom of the stairs, its features obscured, but its presence undeniable. And then the figure moved, lunging towards us with a speed that defied reason. We scattered, our screams echoing through the basement as we tried to escape, but the space was too small, too cramped. I could feel the thing's cold breath on the back of my neck, hear its low growl as it closed in on me. Just when I thought it was over, the light from the door flared even brighter, and the figure stopped in its tracks, recoiling as if in pain. The symbols on the door began to glow, a bright burning red, and the padlock melted away like wax. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a pitch-black void beyond. Without thinking, I grabbed Ethan and the others and pulled them towards the door. Whatever was behind us was no longer our biggest threat. Whatever was in front of us was our only hope of escape. We plunged into the darkness, the door slamming shut behind us with a force that shook the entire house. The darkness was absolute, swallowing us whole, but the footsteps, the voice, the figure, they were gone. The only sound now was the thundering of our own hearts. For a moment I thought we had escaped, that we were safe. But then I heard it, a soft whisper, echoing from the depths of the darkness. "You shouldn't have come here." We were not alone. And whatever was in here with us, it was far worse than anything we had left behind. The darkness surrounded us like a thick, suffocating blanket, and for a moment it felt like there was no way out. The whisper echoed in the void, chilling us to the bone. But then something changed. A soft glow began to emanate from the ground beneath our feet, revealing that we were standing in a large, cavernous room. The walls were rough, like the inside of a cave, and the air was damp and cool. The glow intensified, and we saw something that made our hearts skip a beat. A circle of children standing in the center of the room, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. They were the missing kids, the ones who had vanished after Halloween. They were all here alive, but their expressions were frozen in terror, as if they had seen something that had scarred them deeply. And then we saw him, the candy collector. He stood at the edge of the circle, a tall, gaunt figure dressed in tattered clothes that seemed to belong to another era. His face was hidden in shadow, but his eyes glowed with an unnatural light. In his hands, he held a large sack, the kind used to collect candy on Halloween, but it was empty, hanging limply at his side. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered again, his voice a haunting echo that sent shivers down our spines. "But now that you're here, you will understand. You will see what they did to me, and why they must pay." He stepped forward, and the children shrank back, their fear palpable. But there was something else in his eyes, something that made me pause. It wasn't just malice, it was pain, deep and ancient, the kind of pain that could twist a soul into something monstrous. "Please don't hurt them," I found myself saying, my voice trembling. "They're just kids. They didn't do anything to you." The candy collector's eyes flicked toward me, and for a moment I thought he was going to lash out. But instead he stopped, his expression softening ever so slightly. They are the children of those who wronged me, he said, his voice quieter now, almost sad. Their parents, your parents, mocked me, drove me to the edges of this town, and left me to rot. They took everything from me, everything. I could see the anger in his eyes, but beneath it there was a deep, hollow sadness. This was a man who had been wronged, who had been driven to madness by the cruelty of others. But that didn't make what he was doing right. He was taking his pain out on innocent children, perpetuating a cycle of misery and fear. Revenge won't bring back what you lost, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It won't make you whole again, but you can stop this. You can end it now. Let them go. You don't have to be the monster they made you out to be. For a long moment, the candy collector was silent, his eyes searching mine as if trying to find something. Then slowly, he looked back at the children, his gaze softening. They are afraid of me, he said almost to himself. Just as I was afraid, but I never wanted to hurt them. I just wanted them to know, to feel what I felt. Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized that this man, this twisted figure who had become a ghost story to scare children, had once been just like us, innocent, full of life, until something had shattered him. You can still change things, I said softly. You can let them go, and you can find peace. The candy collector hesitated, then slowly nodded. He raised his hand, and the glow in the room brightened. The children blinked, their expressions of fear easing into confusion as they looked around. It was as if a spell had been lifted, the fear draining away, replaced by a quiet calm. The candy collector turned to us, his eyes dimming to a soft, sad glow. Go, he said. Take them home, they don't belong here. We didn't need to be told twice. We gathered the children, guiding them toward the door that had somehow reappeared in the wall behind us. As we led them out of the dark chamber, I glanced back at the candy collector. He stood alone in the glow, his figure slowly fading into the shadows. Thank you, I whispered, though I wasn't sure if he could hear me. As we emerged from the house, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. The cold air felt fresh and clean, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of the basement. The children were safe. We were safe. The police arrived not long after, alerted by the commotion at the old Craven house. When they searched the basement, they found it empty. No candy collector, no mysterious glowing room. Just an old, dilapidated cellar. But they did find the missing children, all of them unharmed, if a little shaken. As for the candy collector, no one ever saw him again. The story of the missing children became just that. A story, one that would be told around campfires and at sleepovers. A cautionary tale about greed and the importance of sharing. But for those of us who had been there, who had seen him, we knew the truth. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who had been wronged, who had lost his way in the darkness of his own pain. But in the end, he chose to let go of his anger, to find peace in the only way he could. The candy collector was gone, but he had left behind a lesson, one that we would never forget. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, bathing the town in its warm golden light, I felt a sense of relief and closure. The nightmare was over. The children were safe. And for the first time in days, I felt like everything was going to be okay. It was a new day, and with it came the promise of hope and healing. The candy collector was a part of the past now, a ghost that had finally found peace. And we too could move forward, leaving the darkness behind us.